Good morning. My name is Peter Titmus from BVN, and I'm presenting the redevelopment of the Sirius building. So the project is a retrofit and an extension of an existing Sirius building at Sydney's Circular Quay. The project contains 75 reconfigured apartments, new work, living spaces, commercial and retail space. It also includes an upgrade of the public domain outside of the site, including 2 public lifts. But first, an acknowledgement that this part of Sydney is the land of the traditional owners of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. So the project retains a derelict government housing building and reimagines its next life through restoration, careful retrofit and the insertion of additional built form. And it's through these lenses that I'll present the project. So the building is instantly identifiable to those who live in Sydney and those visiting in this context at Circular Quay. It's adjacent to the Harbour Bridge and its upper levels extend above the Harbour Bridge approach, so it's very visible. And it sits in one of Australia's oldest preserved colonial precincts known as the Rocks. The building has always been polarising. It's a brutalist building in a sensitive heritage area, and it's not helped by its decades of neglect in maintenance. When we came to it, the building was vacant. It was derelict and dilapidated, and the government was selling the building. So rather than pay for the significant costs of its upkeep, the strategy was to sell the building to pay for new housing elsewhere. And the public conversation had moved to whether it should be kept or demolished, and the government sale anticipated its demolition, and this was written into the tender of the building. Importantly, despite lobbying, the government refused heritage listing on the building. So our first move was to find a developer interested in the proposition to retain the building. And our preference for retention was multifaceted. The first was consideration of the social story and understanding that place and city as layered stories. When legible, these stories contribute to an ongoing evolution. And the story of Sirius is connected to the development of Sydney's earliest working harbour at Circular Quay, around which a fine grain of workers' housing was established over time, and while still intact, much of this was removed for substantial infrastructure projects such as the Harbour Bridge. And it's in this context that the original Sirius building was conceived to house those who were displaced. And you can see here that it's a mix of in situ concrete and precast windows, it was a bold move from the government's architect at the time, Teo Gophers. It was radical, polarising, and it was conceived in an unashamedly forward-looking tradition. Interestingly, though, it's a very thin plan. Most of the apartments are dual-fronted and look both east and west up the harbour, and this was unlikely to be realised in a rebuild proposition. Architecturally, it's one of the few remaining buildings of this type in Australia. Either brutalist or metabolist style, these buildings have been largely demolished, and it's a trend, I guess, around the world at this point. But possibly the most pressing need for retention was the amount of embodied carbon that could be saved, and as architects we proposed the retention and retrofit as part of the initial tenderer's bid. But due to the building's profile, we then had to sit through a design competition, and at which time we had a carbon its saving assessed as part of our submission. So the second part of the story is restoration. And as concrete building this age has its challenges. Literally hundreds of areas of the building were infrared surveyed to establish where the reinforcement was, and hundreds of these pieces chipped out and replaced. And the strategy was to put a board formwork on them so that they were largely concealed, and then a impregnating sealer applied to the concrete. And cleaned and sealed, the original colouring of the concrete was revealed. Gloucester Walk, a public thoroughfare adjacent to the site, was also upgraded as part of the project. And this was new paving and bounding walls that had a reference to the sandstone that was prevalent in the area. The most intact of the interiors was preserved. This is the original communal room, which is retained in the new project, and the artwork's restored. And the heavily yellowing timber was removed, stripped and recoated and replaced on site. But restoring a building of this age also meant upgrading its building structure. What was seemingly robust with sheer walls was sitting on these very thin columns in the basement, well below current earthquake codes. And new lifts were designed in the lower wings as box trusses that would stabilise the building. And other elements and details were restored and reinstated to work with the new. Which brings me to reimagining, which really focused around 3 areas: the ground plane interface with the heritage precinct, the upgrade to the existing apartments, and finally the new elements that were established on top of the building. So the area where the project could provide the most public benefit was at that awkward interface of the 70s brutalism and the colonial precinct. Occupying a long contour in the rocks, the project had the opportunity to reconnect a public journey up the levels of the rocks from the sea level up to the bridge. And these are those interfaces. The 2 on the left are the Gloucester Walk interfaces with that impenetrable podium wall. And then there's a derelict public park at the north and a big gash between the street and the building at the street level to go down to the basement car park. So at Gloucester Walk, that wall there were insertions made into that wall, which meant taking some of the space from the basement to provide activity. And these were commercial/residential elements that were able to be inhabited and activate the walk. And at the middle of the site, an apartment was actually taken out to enable a through-site link for the public through the building, and you can see it down the bottom there with a public lift. This has the benefit of new views through the building and across the precinct to the harbour. And that car park ramp was integrated into a new street building that you can't see in this one, but the building next door is the same height and holds the street the same way. And this has that entry to the basement, but it also has a cafe, a pool and gym, and all of the services for this building are now contained in this street building. And that's the pool above and the gym below. The second strategy enables outdoor space to every apartment. And while many had access to roof terraces, this is generally not achieved across the building, in the original building. So this meant looking at those precast reveals and how they could be substituted with another element to enable that to happen. And with a very finely engineered structure, this had to be very lightweight. And I guess with a building of this type, there are significant tolerances, which mean prefabricating is also quite challenging. So a strategy was made of a receiving frame, and then we were able to prefabricate these elements in a factory. And these were geometry that clearly references the original, but the copper was chosen to age with the building as it then settled back into its place. In a similar way, new elements were added to the height of the building. There's almost 2,000 square metres of GFA added to the height. You can see that was retaining the modules and the modulating form of the roofscape. And these included gardens, solar panels, and pools on top of the roof, which all prefabricated and dropped into place. But the biggest challenge, really, was the services and structure for this building. With a 2.4 slab to underside slab, there was very little room for reticulation of services. The original building didn't have much of the services that would be expected of a contemporary apartment. So instead, a series of risers were drilled through the building. As you can see, all these red dots are the new risers that come up through the apartments, and then joinery was used along the walls to reticulate the services, which meant fine coordination of each space. And the tolerances in the concrete meant that not every apartment was actually 2.4 slab to underside a slab, and so every apartment was detailedly surveyed, and grinding and filling was established to make sure that the maximum ceiling heights were achieved. Which brings me finally to the apartment interiors. While most of the apartments were dual aspect, the planning really limited your perception of the two aspects. And you can see here also the various configuration apartments in that section, the standard being a staggered two-bedder. Then the proposition was to move the living space to the bigger module. Each module was slightly different, and to open up the planning so that the views up and down the harbour, and the breezes could be leveraged, I guess. And you can see the joinery walls here concealing the surfaces that leave the ceiling heights as high as possible. And each of the apartments is characterised by that joinery and the split level stairs. The modules enabled us to reconfigure the apartments, so what was 2 modules configured together could become 3 or 4 or 5 modules as different apartment types were established around the building. So the result is a clear reading of new and old and a harmonious contribution to its neighbourhood. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I go first. I'm curious to know how was kind of process to define the brief. I believe like you got the brief, but I think, as you mentioned in the reimagining, like 3 point, this connection, like additional balcony and skyline is kind of your proposal. Then how was the discussion with the client to define the program of the building?
So the planning controls meant that if you would demolish the building, you could only build up to the height of the harbour bridge, so you couldn't build the height, you'd had to build wider. So, and if you kept the building, you could build additional height on the building, but you couldn't add beyond a certain level of GFA. So some of the strategies were to build more higher and less lower. Sorry, just your question again was establishing the brief in terms of the types of apartments, or?
Yeah, so how was the discussion with the client to define like how this kind of 3 element to put into the project?
Sorry, and sorry, where I was getting to is the number of planning submissions and approvals we went through drove a lot of those discussions and what could be achieved, and I guess leaving the module intact kind of drove a sort of outcome where you could join a number of modules together to make larger apartments which were at the higher levels, and then the lower levels kept the original configuration of apartments.
I think ingenuity is the bottom line here, and I'm very intrigued as I think you're very ingenious, and I think you've managed to sort of still carry much of the spirit of the earlier architecture. I was watching to see at what point it would sort of get smothered. And I don't think it has, but I think I'm quite liking the scheme, because I think ingenuity in of itself is very undervalued in most architectural discussions. It goes usually misunderstood as having to be pragmatic. But I think being ingenious involves even issues of style, issues of the kind of culture that you're trying to put into the building, which may have historically changed, but may be intentionally changed because of the demographics and so on. And I think this is quite ingenious. And making a general point, I think that in Australia, there is a sort of attitude to architecture which is sort of part craft and part naughtiness, which suits this proposition. So I think you carried that through rather well.
Thank you.
But just to kind of follow up from that, I mean, I think this relationship between retrofitting, reimagining, and the kind of layers that you bring in, you discuss them in very sort of practical ways. And I'm wondering, now that you're done with the project, what are your sort of reflections in terms of the nuance of difference between like the original, the idea of retrofit, and what you end up with? You now have the benefit of time. I'm wondering how you reflect on this in a more, if you were to present it more in terms of the architectural consequences in some way.
And along the way, I think we were all quite fearful that we might have smothered or we might have not done enough. So I think in hindsight, and looking at it now that I see it every day, there is enough of both. There is enough of a new spirit, but there is a perception of the old that's still very readable in the project. So, I think in reflection, it thankfully kind of found the right balance in my eyes.
Okay, great, thank you. Anybody else? Dorinda, do you have anything you want to know?
Was this a rental apartments or owned apartments?
These are from a market sale, yeah.
So, And then my question was, did you ever do a study to show, was it more sustainable to, but besides the fact that it was a worthy building, worth saving, was it more sustainable and more, it wasn't more cost effective, but it was
certainly
more
wasn't, no.
sustainable to
Yes.
do what you did?
Yes, so we haven't gone back and done the as-built calculation on the carbon saving, but certainly there was enough saving there from a sustainability point of view that it was always going to be more sustainable to keep it than to demolish.
Okay. Anything else? So I suppose one quick question would be really the challenges in some way of trying to do this retrofitting and at the same time kind of dealing with the restoration. You showed us some plans where you had, the original structure, the transformation. Can you speak a little bit about the challenges of the kind of retrofit versus reimagining?
Yes, and so the apartments are incredibly small compared to what we would have for codes now. So there was trying to work with the 2.4, but also the width was very narrow. It had no insulation, so adding insulation to the walls made the apartments smaller again. So everything therefore became very critical, and so the amount of work to make sure things were coordinated, you couldn't have a zone, you had to down to the millimetre of tolerance. And then the engineering itself, the structure wasn't rated for a considerable amount of extra load, so everything that was put into the building was assessed for its weight on the structure, including some of the pools and other things as well that added extra weight, not necessarily GFA. So you were working with those parameters, which just meant every step of the way had to be assessed by numbers of people, and it was a very kind of painstaking process.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.